Hello, my name is Alex.
And my name is Sean.
And we're here to tell you a little bit about the Cold War.
The Cold War took place in 1947 through 1991. The Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union.
The Cold War is one of the most interesting to myself and significant because of all the important landmarks that took place in between. Some of the most important history took place during this time period, just like my favorite, the space to race.
Today we have broken up the Cold War into 4 important parts so it's easiest to understand and enjoy.
The origins of the Cold War. The Cold War was the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is also known as the USSR. The Soviet Union and the United States were once allies in the World War II. Although these nations fought against the Axis powers together, the United States was very concerned of their leader's communist ways. The Soviets were under control of communist leader Joseph Stalin. When World War II ended, the Cold War started in 1947. This war is thought to have been inevitable to most historians.
The beginning of the Cold War. The reason between the two nations going to war was because the Soviets wanted to spread their communism and the United States were trying to contain it. Harry Truman, the U.S. president during the Cold War, agreed on a policy to help contain the Russians, but to also help any Russians that were in need. Later, that same policy developed into a policy for the United States to use their military forces to contain the USSR's communism ways by attempting to spread to the other neighbor countries. However, the Americans knew what they were up against since they were once allies in the World War. The United States had to have created a strong enough plan to make sure we wouldn't fall, but that they would. President Truman then announced that he would create a destructive bomb even more than that one of the atomic bomb. It was called the super bomb. Although this was pretty intimidating to the Soviets, the United States would also be threatened. No Americans would ever want to be under an atomic war. To be prepared, most Americans began to go under a nuclear war. People had bomb huts in their backyards to keep safe. Children and schoolgoers were taught protective behavior in case of a bomb, and the town practiced bomb drills.
The race to space. In 1957, the Soviets released their first satellite into space called Sputnik. This was threatening to the United States because this was the Soviets' way of expanding. To keep up with the Soviets, the United States needed to expand to space also, and very quickly. A year later, the United States launched its first satellite into space also. In 1958, we got President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower signed a public order creating NASA, which also was launching our first man to space after the Soviets did. Later, President John F. Kennedy made the announcement that we would officially have someone land on the moon, which came true when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969 before the Soviets did, which would win the space race.
The Cold War coming to an end. President Nixon took power and immediately knew we were in desperate need of a new and alternate approach to this war. The United States began to create a relationship with communist Beijing after a trip there in 1972. Eventually, we adopted the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty that eliminated both nations from creating any more nuclear powers. This would technically protect both citizens in an effort of having no nuclear outbreak. When President Ronald Reagan became chief of military, things changed. Reagan viewed communism as a huge threat. The Soviets were slowly but surely expanding due to the surrounding weaker governments. With Americans' help, eventually the Soviets came to a slow and dwindling end. When President Ronald Reagan told their leader to tear down the Berlin Wall, he did. And when the wall came down...
Well, this sums up the Cold War, and we hope this brings a better understanding to my favorite war to study.
See ya.
Thank you. Goodbye.